Welcome to Cider Chat. It's the return of the Ask Ryan series with Ryan Monkman of FieldBird Cider. Hello, my name is Rhea Windcaller, and I am the producer and cider MC of this weekly podcast, where we speak with makers, cider enthusiasts, and folks within the cider trade from around the world. Over the past 6 seasons of Cider Chat and up to 268 episodes, there is one guest that listeners keep on referring to when they send me emails or I get to talk to them, and that is how much Ryan Monkman delivers and provides really tangible tips in techniques of cider making, who is able to deliver what can feel really complex into a very straightforward and understandable user-friendly mode. And for that, I love him. And I also adore the guy because he's just a great person. So we're going to have another Ask Ryan series, as I did last year in 2020, with this Canadian maker who is just helping everyone all over the world. And you're going to hear more about that as I go into this week's episode, specifically an email that once again mentions Ryan Monkman. But before we go there, let's first start with a bit of news out and about in Ciderville. We have an email from our friend Marcel in the Netherlands, and he has a cidery called De Heretner. I'll put a link in the show notes to that. And he writes, he's asking, about the pandemic, and he's in good health, and he wanted to send along an update, which I'm so stoked to share with you. So he writes, every week on Wednesday morning, I listen to Cider Chat. Still going strong. Again, thanks for all the great information. Last week, I listened to Ryan Monkman's interviews again. There you go, right? This year will mark the beginning of working with barrels. I am testing with small barrels and wood sticks just to see what they will do to our cider. It is a decision to decide what barrels to start, how to clean, how to store, etc. The goal is to have some cider in oak barrels by the end of the year. In the fall of last year, we finally got a permit for the alcohol taxes and started selling. However, we planned to start with restaurants, and we all know what happened there. We now deliver to a handful of stores that are willing to give some extra attention to this new drink over here. We also sell a lot more than we hoped for through our web shop and at the cidery, and that feels very good with the COVID thing still sneaking up on our herb business every day. So Marcel has an on-site farm where they are growing and selling herbs and, of course, the cidery. And I think it's kind of interesting that he mentions that they're doing really good with on-site premise selling and through the store. So that kind of also rings true with what we're seeing here in the U.S. He continues with, last year we picked fruit from a very nice high-stemmed orchard on a hill in the south of our province, Limburg. All ancient varieties from this region, not fertilized, not irrigated, and not sprayed with anything, just managed by nature. Wow. We pressed about 3,000 liters from these apples, and every time we taste, we are more surprised of what they are becoming. Ooh, that makes me clap. Last year, I mentioned we had to cancel the order of some cider equipment. Now, I can say we have it all in place, thanks to a gift from my mother. Seems she likes cider too. Thanks, Mom. Oh, I love that. So next week we are going to bottle the first batch of this pressing. Bottled condition dry cider it will be. I had this very clear vision about making special dry ciders, maybe some with a little residual sugar, but no really sweet stuff. However, I always felt I had to make a bit of cider that was really easy to drink for people who never had any cider. Back-sweetened, carbonized, pasteurized fruit, easy to drink. The experience over the last half year tilted this vision many times, and I have been amazed about how people react to different ciders. It seems that many people that never heard of cider and drink it for the first time really like the dry ones. Result, still no pasteurized ciders available in our cidery. and maybe we should really stick with the all-natural approach and let the cider be alive in the bottle, change over time, and do its thing. Right on. One other thing that amazed me was the notion that we had a disadvantage in our region with having no cider history. Then came a nice discussion on CiderCon, in which people in the UK did see it as a big disadvantage that everybody knew what cider was, and it seemed very difficult to take it to a different level. So that's interesting, right? And he continues with, eye-opening if you look at it this way. We are blessed with not knowing anything. We can all learn as we go along. Yeah, that is spot on. Oh, and we are in a book about Dutch craft cider, together with 7 other cideries. Cider going up in our small country. Well, that sure is a perfect example of cider going up, and how cool to be in a book. I'm going to see if I could track down a link for that book so folks can find it, because if you're going to the Netherlands, this is a book you're going to want, even if it's in Dutch, because it'll give you a nice resource and a backstory. You can always use Google Translate too. And it's a fantastic country to visit. It's one that's so deeply connected to my heart. Thanks again, Marcel. Keep us in the loop. I love getting these updates. Craftcon is coming up on April 29th and 30th, so you got a little bit of time here to sign up to a virtual conference with our friends in the UK, and they're bringing in folks all over the place for conversations online. You'll find a link in the show notes where you could find out more, but you could just Google 3 Counties Cider and Perry Association or Craftcon 2021. You know I'll be there, and I'm going to be moderating a panel discussion with Adam Wells, Kath Potter, and Nikki Kong, all Brits sharing some info on how to bring the bellies to the bar, or what I like to call cider and the laws of attraction. Check it out at Craftcon 2021, April 29th and 30th. We have another email, and this one is coming in from England. It is written by Catherine. Catherine and Helen are the owners of Grazed Cider on the Isle of Wight, and that is south of London, and it's an island where, you can't get there from here. I think you either take a tunnel or a ferry. She writes, "Hello, Ria. I sent you via PayPal a donation. Hope a part of my economic relief helps you to continue to produce your great cider podcasts. 2 of us make up the women-owned and run small orchard cidery called Grazed Cider," which is an awesome name, on the Isle of Wight in southern England. We planted our traditional cider orchard 7 years ago. While we were waiting for the trees to produce, we put out a call for apples going to waste in trade for apple juice and got a terrific response. We press and slow ferment in a cave, man-made when the old trains came through. Wow, holy smokes. This will be our 2nd year selling cave-crafted cider locally. Oh my goodness, I love this. With things slowing down with lockdowns, etc., I decided to have a go at couch to a 5K running, and your podcasts got me to that goal. Yeah! And the best thing was I was getting inspired as I ran. We have now put some lees in the freezer for use next year. Ryan, I think, and are going to try Bâtonnage. Anyways, just wanted to thank you. Looking forward to many more inspiring podcasts. Well, thank you so much, Catherine. Oh my goodness. Well, here we go again. Ryan. I'm not sure if that was him. I think that might have been John Bunker and Jean-Claude Jacquelin when they were talking about lees. That was in the episode called Not All Lees Are Gross, and it was featuring Kurt Scheer, who had at one time owned a cidery called Millstone in Maryland. And behind the scenes, those 2 famous Apple people, Claude and John Bunker, were talking too. So I think they mentioned about putting in the freezer. It could have been Ryan. And of course, Ryan was all about Bâtonnage. And of course, this week we have Ryan again. So, this is how it goes. It rolls in this amazing way. And thank you. Thank you so much. In this case, Catherine used the PayPal donation button at ciderchat.com to send a very generous donation. And honestly, I am floored. So thank you. And I really want to come and visit your cidery. I hope that could happen sooner than later. So fingers crossed to everyone staying healthy and the world opening. And a big tip of the glass to you both. I mean, shoot, caved crafted cider. Yow. I'm floored. Got to take a pause.
Walking through the orchards.
And now a little word from our sponsor, Fermentus, with their weekly Q&A. And once again, we're going to be hearing from Kevin Lane. But before we go there, I'd like you to know that there are 2 upcoming online presentations coming out of Fermentus Academy. One is on exploring the diversity of yeast strains and fermentation conditions for different cider styles. And that's going to be coming up on May 20th. On May 27th, they're going to be talking about yeast, nutrition, and fermentation management for cider makers. You could register by going to fermentus.com. Look up the newsroom tab and then the news and events tab. Again, I'll have a link in the show notes to this here episode 269. Meanwhile, let's head next to Kevin Lane as he talks about the question of what causes stuck fermentation.
Hello, my name is Kevin Lane, and I'm the Technical Sales Support Manager for the Americas for Fermentus. Oh, I wish it was an easy answer to that question. Unfortunately, there's a lot of options for what causes a stuck fermentation. Sometimes it could be nutrient deficiency. Sometimes it could be the yeast strain and its ability to tolerate a certain alcohol, or for that matter, a certain pH, or potentially even the temperature could have some effect on that. I know that we've done some studies on different strains at elevated temperatures, targeting a very high alcohol, 15, 16, maybe up to 18% alcohol. And some strains that are fully capable of reaching 18%, for example, will stall out at 13 or 14% because the temperature is too high, which in turn causes even more of a stressful environment when alcohol is present. So, there's a huge list, a very long list of different things that can cause stuck fermentations. I wish that it was really simple and that it was just a very clear single answer. What I would recommend if you do have a stuck fermentation ever is for sure consult with somebody with a yeast supplier, and try to walk through what you did, what the exact recipe was, what the timing of additions were with the yeast supplier, and give them the full story so that they have an idea of what potentially could have happened. I think that's probably one of the hardest things about my job, about working for a yeast supplier, not only my job, but everybody that I work with, is that sometimes people will come to us with a question about why did this happen? And it's very difficult to make even an educated guess unless we have a good idea of what happened before, for example, stuck fermentation happened. So really, if you do end up with a stuck fermentation ever, I hope you don't, but if you do end up with one, for sure take as much of the story as you can to a yeast supplier, talk through as many details as you can with them, to try to give them as much information as you can so that they can make a better educated guess. In the end, we most likely weren't there when you were making the cider initially, so the best we can do is really make educated guesses, but we can't make an educated guess unless we get really a lot of the information about what went into the tank, and the timing and everything, and temperature and pitch rate and everything that you could think of, just to make an educated guess and say it probably was this.
And the moral of this story is take notes when you're making cider. So when you follow up on why the heck you have a stuck fermentation and you're talking to Kevin Lane at Fermentus, you will have your notes to refer to. I always say, really got to take better notes as I talk to myself, which is what podcasters do. Anyways, you want to find out more info, go to fermentus.com. Dancing in the streets. It's time now for our featured conversation with Ryan Monkman of FieldBird Cider. This is an Ontario-based cidery, and you could find their website at fieldbird.ca, where you'll find a selection of their ciders and perries. Before we go into the featured conversation discussing how to manage bottle fermentation, I'm just going to give you a little bit of a taste of behind-the-scenes chatter with Ryan regarding some of the emails, specifically the email from Grazed Cider that I already read on the podcast here on this here episode, on how she was talking about fermenting cider in caves and how his talks are inspiring her. He replies,
I'm thinking about being on the Isle of right now and being in a cave.
Yeah.
And how cool that would be.
I know.
And stirring a barrel down there. And the whole time muttering under your breath, why the hell did Ryan get us into this? We could be surfing.
I think that gives you a good sense of who Ryan Monkman is. He has that wee bit of self-deprecation laced with a whole bunch of knowledge, which really makes him such an amazing person to be able to tap into for me and for so many others out there in Ciderville. Now we're going to head to our first in a series of Ask Ryan episodes, beginning with this one here on episode 269. This week, we're delving back into barrel fermenting cider, barrel fermenting as in oak barrels, which is one of the specialties that FieldBird does with their ciders and perries. And the discussion is on gross lees, whether or not you rack the cider off the gross lees or leave the gross lees in the barrel the entire amount of time, even while you're doing bâtonnage. Let's head to this featured conversation now with Ryan Monkman. The question of the lees and leaving the gross lees in the barrel, and folks were saying that's not a good idea. You shouldn't leave the gross lees in the barrel, but that's exactly what you do. You don't take that out at all. Is that correct?
I will say that is generally correct.
Okay.
There's different definitions of gross lees. So from a technical standpoint, gross lees are the sediment from juice. So prior to fermentation. Mm-hmm. So if you just took juice, didn't settle it at all, and put it into barrel, the sediment that forms on the bottom before fermentation is generally referred to as gross lees. I want to say about 20% of the stuff I ferment is with gross lees. And we generally refer to those as heavy solids ferments. So fermenting unsettled juice. Yes, I do leave them in barrel, but there's a fermentation technique I use to compensate for it. So the difficulty you run into with gross lees is that all those little bits of pulp and stuff like that love to bind with oxygen. Mm. And when they bind with oxygen, that oxygen is not available to your yeast, and can cause reductive ferments that perhaps more reductive than you want. So you're getting those off flavors of like, rotting eggs and stuff like that. And then those flavors end up in the lees. And if you leave it for too long, it can start releasing back into the cider. So I think that's the fear that people have. One way to manage it is to manage your oxygen during fermentation. So with a heavy solids ferment, so where you're leaving the juice lees in, those ferments need more oxygen than a normal ferment does. So most ferments with settled juice don't really need a lot of oxygen added to them by racking or anything like that, except in some extreme cases. We do use it as a tool in spontaneous ferments, because when you add oxygen to something that's fermenting, you stop active fermentation and the yeast make babies.
Mm-hmm.
So you can kind of accelerate a spontaneous ferment with that technique. But with gross lees, we will often do what's called a rack and return during fermentation. So we'll pull everything out of barrel, splash it around so it gets some oxygen into it, and then throw it back in the barrel.
Mm-hmm.
And that helps introduce a little more oxygen in a controlled way, which prevents reduction from going too far, which means that the lees stay healthy and clean, which means we can age on the lees and then everything's fine.
Mm-hmm. How soon into the fermentation do you typically do the rack and return? I know there's not a typical necessarily, but because the gross lees will, they drop out pretty soon early on. Within that first month, you're getting gross lees.
Oh, I would say, so if you're tracking your ferment, like 1/3 through alcoholic fermentation, it's really important to do it during alcoholic fermentation. Generally speaking, oxygen can be a friend and a foe, right? So there are times when you want oxygen, there are times when you don't want oxygen. And during fermentation is a time when oxygen is typically a friend. So in a controlled way of having some air in there helps you during fermentation, because it helps yeast be healthy and make babies, helps prevent reduction. Post-alcoholic fermentation, oxygen can be a detriment because it can oxidize flavors. So you lose flavors. So the reason we top barrels after fermentation is to prevent too much oxygen ingress. So when you use oxygen is very important. There's also a technique called macro-ox, which is different than micro-ox, which is a different technique. But macro-ox is when you intentionally over-oxidize juice before fermentation. So you take your juice and you bubble it with air, you splash it around, you do all those sorts of things, don't add any sulfur. And then during fermentation, so the premise of that is anything that would oxidize later gets oxidized at the juice stage. Fermentation will basically cause that oxidation to drop out. So after fermentation, the cider is no longer oxidized and is less likely to become oxidized long term. However, you'll develop different types of flavor. So it won't be fruity, it'll be more textural. So this is a technique in winemaking that is often used in Chardonnay, but like never used in Pinot Gris, because Pinot Gris or Sauvignon Blanc, where you want stuff to be fruity. It's not a good technique to use, but if you want something to age really well and be more textural than aromatic, it's a technique to use. So we use that as well on the full solid ferments. There's a really good book. There's actually a really good book. I would say that anyone who is interested in the science side of oxygen, but also something called Brett management, or some membrane technologies and things like that. But a good book about oxygen and oxygen use, as well as Brett control, is called Postmodern Winemaking. It's available, wherever good winemaking books are sold. It's a really, really good book. Quite technical. It's a good daytime reading book, but well worth reading if you want to approach cider making these questions about things like gross lees and things like that from a more scientific perspective and oxygen management. It's a really good book to read.
Fantastic. Great tip. In short, am I understanding it then that you are racking and returning, you're saying during the alcohol production? So that's like right in primary ferment.
Yeah.
So a couple days in, stuff is dropping out, and it doesn't take long for that to happen. And it could be a pretty robust ferment too happening that you do the rack and return. Okay.
Yeah. And when you do it, when you do a full solids ferment and you do things like rack and return, you're increasing your yeast populations, and it's going to be a vigorous ferment. So you've got to be pretty quick on it. The timing of the rack and return, generally I would say is somewhere between a third and a half through alcoholic fermentation, or at the onset of productive aromas. So if something starts to smell off, do it then.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. It's one of those things like, don't say, oh, I'll do it tomorrow, I'll do it this evening. Just do it when you think it's time.
Right. Yeah.
The other thing I'll say about it is, if you are doing full solid ferments, like with the gross leads, like without settling the juice, the macro ox approach, where you intentionally oxidize the juice before fermentation, is a cool approach to take. It works pretty well with full solid ferments. And like for those of you making stuff in carboys and things like that, I would suggest doing a side-by-side test. So get some juice, enough for 2 carboys, put one in the carboy and straight into fermentation, maybe do a rack and return during fermentation. Rack and return just means taking it out of the vessel, splashing it a bit, and putting it back into the vessel. And so do that on one of them, and on the other one, splash it around like crazy, get it good and brown before fermentation, and then ferment it and see what happens. If you want an easy way to add oxygen to something, get an oil-free air compressor.
Okay. Wow.
Pump it.
Is that what you use?
No. I either use rack and return techniques, or during harvest we bring in tanks of food grade oxygen.
Food grade oxygen. Is that different than human grade oxygen?
It's most ciders are familiar with CO2 tanks and stuff like that. It's just compressed oxygen. Food grade has to do more with the way the canisters themselves are filled by the supplier. Oxygen is also used for welding, right? And in that process, those tanks can pick up things like grease and things like that, and you don't want that.
Right. Yeah. Don't hook Uncle John up to it if the O2 is not available.
Yeah. So it costs like an extra $4 to get food grade as opposed to standard. So
cool. Very good.
Spend the $4 if you're going to go that route. A food grade oxygen regulator is like $600. So,
wow.
I would not go that route unless you intend to do a lot of oxygen adds.
Yeah, and it's a science.
We use oxygen in our spontaneous ferments. When fermentation starts to pick up, I usually give it a decent hit of oxygen, with the intention of actually pausing alcoholic fermentation, giving yeast some time to make babies and multiply, and then letting that wild yeast go back to fermenting and taking over.
You describe what macro OX is, but what about micro?
Oh, micro ox is an aging technique. We don't use micro ox. It's an interesting technique used in some wineries. I don't know of any cideries with a micro ox setup. There's an interplay of oxygen and tannin through the aging process. So if you're aging something that's tannic in barrel, you'll have this experience that there is initially it's not actually that pleasing. It can be quite astringent. And then over time, the tannins become smoother and velvety. And that is an interplay of oxygen and tannin and oak and a few other chemical relationships. Micro-ox is a system where you can do that process in a controlled fashion. So you add, using pretty sophisticated equipment in tall tanks, you add a specific amount of oxygen per day for a few weeks. And you can create the relationship between tannin and oxygen in a safe, controlled way. It's talked about quite a bit in postmodern winemaking. And a previous guest on your show, Thierry Lemaire, is one of the scientists who did the initial research and creation of micro-ox, and is mentioned in the introduction of postmodern winemaking.
Fantastic.
So Thierry is easily earlier you said I'm one of the smartest people you know, which I appreciate, but I don't think is actually true. Thierry is the smartest person I've ever met in my life. Some really smart people.
Yeah.
But Thierry just blows my mind on a never-ending basis. And the fact that I'm able to count him as a friend is one of the greatest blessings in my life.
Yeah. I knew I was sitting next to greatness at that dinner that we had, back in 2018.
Dude also speaks like 6 or 8 languages.
That helps.
Cool.
Yeah. That definitely helps. It really does, especially in the world of fermentation, because you have like these French studies coming out and Spanish studies, and it's really valuable.
So he works quite a bit in Canada, and a little bit in the States, but he's based in France near the Basque region of Spain.
Mm-hmm. In the show notes to this here episode 269, titled Gross Lees in the Barrel, you'll find links to past episodes with Ryan Monkman, and also a link to the book that he recommended. Next week, we return with part 2 of Ask Ryan, and we'll be looking at bottle conditioning cider. Once again, a tip of the glass to all the fine patrons of this here podcast who help keep this podcast on the air. Become a patron today by going to the Cider Chat Patreon page. That's spelled Patreon. And with that, I leave you here. This is Ria Windcaller signing off for now. Looking forward to seeing you in Ciderville.
We like cider. We like palms. We love orchards and having fun. There is a reason. There is a reason why we do it like this. Oh yes, there is. There is a reason why we do it like this. Oh yes, there is. There is a reason why we drink it like this. Oh yes, there is. There is a reason. We like walking through the orchards, dancing in the streets, smelling all the blossoms, kicking up our feet. We like cider, we like palms, we like orchards, having some fun. There is a reason. There is a reason why we do it like this. Oh yes, there is. There is a reason why we do it like this. Oh yes, there is. There is a reason why we drink it like this. Oh yes, there is. There is a reason. We like walking through the orchards, dancing in the streets, smelling all the blossoms, kicking up our feet. Oh yeah. We like cider. Oh yes, we do. We like palms. Oh yes, we do. We love orchards, having some fun. There is a reason. There is a reason why we do it like this. Ba-da-da-dum. There's a reason why we do it like this. Ba-da-da-dum. There is a reason why we drink it like this. Ba-da-da-dum. Ba-da-da-dum. We like walking down the orchards, dancing in the streets, smelling all the blossoms, kicking up our feet. Oh yeah. We like cider. Ba-da-da-dum. We like palms. Oh yes, we do. We like orchards, having some fun.
Yeehaw!